time, we're told, moves in one direction, forward, steady and unbroken. But scattered throughout history are accounts that challenge that assumption entirely. Ordinary people in ordinary places suddenly finding themselves somewhere else. No explanation, no warning, just the world as it was, bleeding through into the world as it is. The following 5 cases come from different countries and different walks of life. What connects them is simple. None of them should have happened. In October 1979, Len and Cynthia Gisby and Jeff and Pauline Simpson left their homes in Dover, England for a holiday to northern Spain. It was a driving holiday that would take them through France. They took the ferry across a channel where they were to spend 2 weeks driving through the countryside of France before proceeding to northern Spain. The drive started out without any major dramas, and on the evening of October the 3rd, they were travelling north of Montélimar, France, looking for a place to eat and spend the night. A short time later, they came across a motel, and when they entered the building, they were informed by the receptionist that there were no vacancies. However, he directed them to another possible place they could stay and gave them directions which led them to a small hotel just off of the freeway. They had no trouble finding the road that led to a series of old buildings that appeared to be old-worldly, and the buildings were covered in old-fashioned posters, where one particular poster was advertising a circus that looked to be very old in its design. As they looked around, they could plainly see that everything they were looking at appeared to be from another era, as the streets had cobblestones that were very narrow. It all seemed to be built for pedestrians and the horse and cart, but certainly not wide enough for easy car access. It was not long before they came across a building that was brightly lit with a few men standing outside. After making inquiries, they found it was not a hotel but was actually an inn, so they continued walking until they came to 2 buildings that were close to each other. One was a police station and the other showed a large sign that said hotel. The hotel was not modern in any way, with 2 stories, and looked very old-fashioned. However, it looked clean and the couple were too tired to search for another. Fortunately, they were able to get rooms for the night. Communicating was difficult as nobody could speak French and receptionists could not speak English, but they nevertheless managed to book rooms for the night. The inside of the hotel looked even older than the outside, where everything was old and made of heavy wood. As they looked around at the dining tables, they found there were no tablecloths, just a wooden table. As they glanced around the room, they could see no sign of a telephone or elevator, and it was as if they'd stepped back 100 years, as nothing around them was in the slightest bit modern. As they walked up to their respective bedrooms, they found them to be as old as the rest of the hotel. The beds were large and heavy, and although there were bolsters to rest their heads, there was no actual pillows. There were no locks on the doors, only a catch, and there was no glass in the windows, just wooden shutters. The plumbing in the shared bathroom looked to be very old. However, it was very clean and looked reasonably comfortable, and they were too tired to quibble. Overall, the outdated appearance gave everything a sense of charm. It was certainly different, but there were more surprises to come. After resting and unpacking, they made their way to the dining room, where they ordered eggs, steak and potatoes, and drank lager. But what surprised them was that the cutlery appeared to be very old. After dinner, they went back upstairs, tired but satisfied, and had a good night's rest. The following morning they returned to the dining room, where they had a simple breakfast of bread, jam and coffee. Unfortunately, they found the coffee was almost undrinkable. As they were having breakfast, they observed the other guests that had entered the dining room, and found they were dressed rather old-fashioned. There was a woman wearing a silk evening gown, and under her arms was a small dog. Then 2 gendarmes appeared in strange uniforms that were unlike anything they'd ever encountered in France. The 2 couples were more enchanted than confused by all that they'd seen, and decided to take a few photographs. Jeff Simpson photographed his wife Pauline standing by the old window, while Len Gisby took a photo of his wife Cynthia inside the hotel, and when they went outside they took a snap of the hotel from the outside. Len and Jeff then attempted to communicate with the gendarmes by asking directions to the freeway that would take them to the Spanish border. The gendarmes were rather confused by their questions and did not seem to understand the word freeway and just shrugged. Eventually, the policemen seemed to understand what they were asking and advised them to take the old Avignon road. Len and Jeff felt the directions they were given seemed to be a roundabout way of getting to the freeway, and instead decided to retrace their steps and go back the way they came in order to get back onto the Montelimar freeway. The next surprise came when they were ready to check out of the small hotel. As Len approached the manager to pay their bill, he was shocked to see that the charge for dinner, accommodation and breakfast came to a meagre 19 francs. That would have been equivalent to $3 in 1979. Len figured the manager had misunderstood and attempted to tell the manager that he was paying for all 4 people and not just himself. But the manager continued to nod as if everything was correct. Len even checked the bill with the gendarmes. They did not want to underpay. They just smiled, suggesting it was correct. When the travellers finally left the hotel, they found the road as deserted as the previous day and had no trouble locating the freeway, and spent an entertaining 2 weeks driving around Spain. As the couples were returning to England via France, they thought it would be a great idea to stay at the same quaint hotel because the prices were so cheap. They found the same turnoff and made their way down the same cobbled road with the old buildings, and everything they saw suggested they were heading in the right direction. However, they could not find the hotel and headed back towards the freeway to the motel to ask for directions. When they spoke to the receptionist, he said he'd never heard of any such hotel. When they asked about the receptionist who'd previously given them the directions to the hotel, he said no such person has ever worked there. Totally confused, the travellers headed back to the location and drove up and down the road in an effort to find the hotel. They did eventually find the building, but it was now in ruins, and next to the ruins they found the remains of what was once a police station. They ended up staying at a hotel in Lyon, which cost them 247 francs. Totally puzzled, they figured there must be a rational explanation for everything, but more surprises were in store. When the photos came back from the developer, they found that none of the images had developed, even though each roll had its proper amount of photographs. It was not that the negatives had been defective in any way, they'd simply vanished. Totally bewildered, the 2 couples decided to tell no one about their experience except family and close friends. Len had described the uniform of the gendarmes to an historian friend who said that its description matched the type worn by the French police at the turn of the century. Another close friend suggested that he experienced a time slip and had inadvertently spent the night in a hotel that had not existed for many decades. What confused both couples the most was, if they had entered a time slip and found themselves in the early 19th century, why did the people not notice their car or question their modern clothes, and how were they able to pay their bill in modern currency? This confused them even more. Had they entered into a parallel dimension? They thought the whole episode should be put behind them, but in 1982 their story was published, and to this day the strange paranormal adventure is now among the most well-known time-slip stories. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. The Man in the Hat. The following is a terrifying story experienced by Rob Andrews and his friend Elle. It was a cold and dark November night as they were driving. They were taking a shortcut through Highland Park into a restaurant. Rob then took a left turn onto Montreal Avenue at the bottom of a small hill. There was an arched pedestrian bridge high above their heads with wooden hills rising sharply on either side. It was not one of the busiest arteries of traffic in the area, but was still commonly used. The road ran upward like a ramp, with a large park and golf course that straddled each side of the road until the hill reached its crest, where the residential housing blocks began to mark the Highland Park sector of the city. Rob had driven the route quite often, as he and Elle had often visited their favourite restaurant. However, Rob sensed that there was something different about this particular night, and then almost immediately after passing through the doorway of the bridge, there was a distinct change about the feeling of their car ride. He couldn't particularly put his finger on anything that happened, but was suddenly and completely enveloped with a terribly heavy sense that something was wrong. He took his foot off the gas pedal, and as the car began to slow, Earl reached over and turned down the radio. The car slowed to a crawl, and he pulled over to the right side of the road and turned to look at Elle, who had an expression on her face as though she was listening for something. Rob was about to say, "I don't know about you," but Elle quickly interrupted him. "I know exactly what you're going to say, and I feel it too." They sat there for a short while, listening to a few faint notes of the radio that were still audible. The park stretched away on both sides of the road, and though it was dark, he could see the vast emptiness of the landscape around them. It was then that he noticed that the street lamps lining the road were all out. Yet it was not raining or even windy, and they could clearly see across the huge expanse of brown grass as their eyes slowly became accustomed to the dark. There was not a living soul in sight, and they wondered what they should do, until Elle said, "Just keep driving." Rob slowly pulled back into the lane and accelerated up the hill. He did not know whether it was the darkness or the shift in the emotion of the atmosphere, but his heart was beating extremely fast from the increased adrenaline in his system. The darkness that surrounded them seemed thick and heavy, and there was not a single car on the road. They just wanted to speed through and reach the top of the hill, and they didn't move or breathe. Rob quickly scanned his eyes around, making sure to check the rearview mirror. There weren't headlights anywhere around. Even with this shortcut they had taken, this was not normal. Except for a bad feeling, nothing terribly seemed out of place. That is until they saw him. As they were coming to a stop sign at the hill's peak, they noticed the man in the darkness, walking down the middle of the road. He was walking at a leisurely pace in the same direction they were driving. He was wearing a black trench coat, black brimmed hat, and he seemed totally unfazed by the approaching car lights. He had not even turned to look at their approaching vehicle. Rob decided to ignore the stop sign. Elle said, "God, don't look at him," as he watched her turn her face towards the passenger side window to avoid him. But he didn't need to say that because he already instinctively knew not to do it himself. He looked to the lower right corner of the windshield as they passed the man and saw Elle crossing her arms over her stomach with his peripheral vision. They rolled down the other side of the hill before reaching residential houses which stood on either side of the road. They now felt safe knowing that they were part of a civilization again. A street light shone in front of them, marking the entrance back into the lights of the city. Rob distinctly remembers fighting the urge to look in the rearview mirror. Elle and Rob did not speak a word until they were seated in the restaurant. It was clear they were both still plagued with the uncomfortable feeling that had started with that initial left turn. "That was awful," he said to Elle to break the silence. They wondered whether they should tell someone about their ordeal, but then thought, who would believe them? With the quietness and stillness, and Rob and Elle experienced some sort of time slip. And who was the strange man in the trench coat and hat, and what would have happened if they'd caught his gaze? Or was he just an innocent man out for an evening stroll?
Annie wrote to us about her father's true story, which he told to her. Her father and his friend were walking through France back in the 1950s. The young men enjoyed going on adventures through rural France, sleeping under the stars at night and being fed courtesy of kind strangers in return for odd jobs and sometimes foraging. One night, deep in the French countryside, he and his friend bedded down for the night under some hedgerows. There were no buildings of any kind as far as the eye could see, also no people or grazing animals, nothing but rough land, literally in the middle of nowhere. At about midnight, and in the pitch black of night, they were ready to sleep when suddenly both of them heard a bell ringing, a school bell in fact. They thought that maybe a cow was wandering around with a bell around its neck that just happened to sound like a school bell. The young men jumped to their feet and looked over the hedge, only to see an old-fashioned wooden school building with a little steeple. The building had large sash windows and looked quaint with flowers planted around it. There, on the steps leading up to the door, was a school teacher in antiquated Victorian garb, a long black dress, a knitted black shawl, ankle boots, and a bodice which looked ridged like a corset was underneath. She was loudly ringing a bell, but did not speak. The men could see the woman as clear as day. She had a stern face, her hair pulled up in a bun on top, and looked about 40 years old. This scene was all lit up, like it was daytime and as if the sun were out. There were children playing in the school dirt playground with skipping ropes, but no modern play equipment. The boys were playing tag. All the girls were dressed in old-fashioned pinafores and with their hair in ribbons. The boys were also in old-fashioned Victorian attire of pantaloons and grubby off-white shirts. They were all making the noises of children playing and laughter noises, but suddenly the children became silent as they all lined up and filed into the building one by one, their hands held in front of them. When they were all inside, the teacher shut the door and the scene just faded out. The whole scene had lasted for about 15 minutes. The two men raced over to the spot, which was literally 200 yards away from where they were standing. They felt shocked and amazed, although not scared, by what they had both witnessed. But there was nothing at all in the space where they had witnessed the strange scene. The next morning they looked again in the spot, but found nothing. They walked to a nearby town and asked around. They were told that indeed there had been a school there in that location in the early 1800s. The school was for the children of local farmers, but tragically had burned to the ground, with the teachers and 15 children perishing in the fire. The two men talked about their eerie experiences for the rest of their lives. Marit in Finland wrote about something that happened to her in the early 90s when she was about 8 years old. She was on a school trip with teachers, parents and siblings to a place about a 4-hour drive away, a small East Finnish town called Savonlinna. The place is famous for its 15th century castle called Olavinlinna, which they visited. The castle's history told of a young maiden who had lost her life in the castle. She fell in love with an enemy Russian soldier with whom she would often meet in secrecy. One day, the soldier asked if they could meet inside the castle at night time, to which the young woman agreed. When night fell, she went to let the man in, but he wasn't alone. There was a whole army waiting outside. She had been deceived by her lover. The men attacked the castle, but were unable to invade it and were driven away. The young woman had played no part in the plot, but was sentenced to death for treason and buried alive in a wall of the castle's inner yard. The story goes that a sign of her innocence, a rowan tree, grew out of her heart and through the wall. This is a story the guides will always tell people who take a tour in the castle. And Marit was standing in the inner yard when the guide told her group this story. Next to her was a couple whom she didn't know, but she heard them saying, "Wow, look at that, it's so high." She looked up to see what they were talking about and saw a small, yet very green and lively looking, rowan tree. It was growing out from the wall, very high up from the ground. She kept looking at this sight and wondered, with her child's brain, how a rowan could grow there. How did the seed get in there? Where did it get its nutrition and water from, etc.? She stared at the tree for a long time with the couple, all finding its presence bizarre. A few years later, at the age of 17, Marit's best friend was now living in Savonlinna. She went to visit her, and together they visited Olavinlinna Castle. Marit told her friend that she wished to see the rowan tree again. There was a tour group waiting to go, so they decided to head inside the castle first so that they wouldn't be in the way of the tour group. They circled around the castle but didn't see the rowan tree, so she wondered if it had fallen down or been cut down. Later, they caught up with the tour group, where the tour guide was telling her group the story of the innocent maiden. Marit and her friends stood nearby and eavesdropped on the story. The guide told her group that there had been a rowan tree growing on one of the castle walls, but it had come down in a bad storm in the 1950s. Marit told her friend that this couldn't be true, as she had seen the tree in the early 90s. When she later did research of the castle's rowan tree, she found out that it had indeed come down in the 1950s during an especially heavy storm. The castle's official webpage also confirmed this. Not only that, but there was a photograph of the said rowan tree that she had discovered, but it was nothing like the tree she had seen. It was very tiny, thin and weedy looking. On top of that, it had been growing in the wrong spot, near the castle's roof's edge. The rowan tree that she and the unknown couple had seen in the 90s was very lush, healthy and green, and was growing around the midway of the castle's inner yard wall. What was especially mysterious was that when she spoke with another friend about the mysterious tree, she also said that she had seen it in the 90s, in the exact same spot where Marit saw it. There were no records of any other rowan trees or any other trees growing out from the castle's wall except the one that was photographed and which came down in the 50s. And that wasn't the tree she saw. She's still wondering, time slip or ghost tree. Our viewer Kevin did not personally experience this time slip, but has heard of the strange story which occurred in his home country of England. The account centres around the Flixborough disaster, which occurred in Lincolnshire, northern England, on Saturday, June 1st, 1974. This was a chemical plant explosion which tragically resulted in 28 deaths. At around noon that day, a resident in the nearby town of Grimsby by the name of Leslie Castleton was watching her television when a newsflash was announced. The word newsflash appeared on the screen, and a male voice reported news of an explosion at the chemical plant in Flixborough, which was about 40 kilometres away. A couple who was staying with Leslie came in soon afterwards, and she mentioned it to them, but they hadn't heard anything about it. That evening, all three saw news reports of the disaster, but were puzzled when the time of the massive explosion was given as late afternoon. The Journal of the Society for Psychical Research investigated this strange phenomenon. They confirmed the reliability of the witnesses and that the explosion was completely unexpected, with no workers on the site suspecting problems. They therefore ruled out any possibility of telepathy and found Leslie's time slip experience to be a case of ostensible precognition. The young woman had a visual and auditory premonition of the disaster hours before the event took place.